construction process, processes, I guess, that I sort of mixed in with the paint. I thought that it was important to, I guess, sort of intertwine these different materials that maybe weren't necessarily the materials that you might normally use for art making, maybe. You'll have to stop me if I get off track.
Okay, all right.
But part of the interest in this process for me, I kind of realized that it was about using sort of industrial machinery and what that meant, or what was it about that appealed to me. And so what I wanted to explore was sort of the interaction of this industrial equipment sort of with the idea of nature, in a way, what we commonly sort of conceive nature or perceive nature to be, and how these two things sort of typically, I think, are perceived kind of as an oppositional binary, and I wanted to sort of show the interconnectedness rather than the oppositional quality of them by sort of trying to blend them.
And you had kind of this interest in looking into nature and culture well before actually coming into the program. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then how you kind of can join that with this kind of interest in monotypes that you talked about, and that experience? I really liked actually how you explained to me in the past just kind of the materiality and that whole interest in machinery, and how that process almost was incredibly instinctual and something you wanted to leave on that level, at least
right.
For the time being.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a pretty extensive, essentially a lot of experience in different fields of construction, like trade work, building things, making things, using machine, like tools, shop tools and saws and all this kind of stuff, which, I mean, I had a pretty established career sort of flowing before I sort of jettisoned back to try to pursue my art. And so there was sort of this...
Another binary.
A binary, right. So then I was trying to, and I think that's part of the reason why I liked it so much, because then right off the bat I was using this kind of shop equipment, this machinery again, the printing press, in a way that was really comfortable. And so I think as far as the process, that was really important in that way. Going back a little further in terms of this sort of being interested in nature, I mean, I've always been, I've always been really interested in nature, and I kind of had this sort of, like, I seemed like when I was young, I was kind of predestined to go into some kind of biology, zoology, or something like that. And so I've always kind of maintained that connection with nature in a way, or what we call nature nowadays, what we tend to perceive as nature as being. But then I kind of abandoned that too when I became kind of a city dweller and sort of got split from that, kind of another binary sort of thing.
In your work now, as it sits there for us, which is sort of maybe the end result of this process that you just talked about. I mean, can you walk through again the connection of that process to this? I mean, so should we think of this as the artwork? Should we think of the videotape, which shows you actually kind of using a steamroller as part of the work? How does the live event that happened here as part of the opening fit into this? I ask all these things because they seem like they all could be the works in and of themselves, in a sense. And I want to get a sense of what the priority is, like how these end products are privileged or not privileged, how they function with the rest of it.
Right. I mean, I'm still kind of working through some of that in terms of like what is supposed to be the focus of the project, or if there is one focus or not. But I mean, essentially the process of using the steamroller was kind of a loose metaphor for how we as a society kind of interact with the earth, and how it's kind of like inherently destructive, how we kind of destroy the land, but at the same time, the result of that destruction is sort of a creation, civilization, kind of urbanized.
And this is the product that...
And so now, that's the thing, there were kind of these two phases to the project. There was kind of like the first phase, which was the actual process and the production, performance. And then now this is, the installation of that is almost kind of like the end result. In a way, it's almost like a, maybe kind of like a, I don't think monument is the right word, but for lack of a better term, I'll say like the monument to that process.
I'm just thinking what might be good to do is to talk about the title of your work in relation to this idea of monumentality and maybe to kind of unpack that for us. Right.
So the title is Quick Millennia, which is kind of a reference to a Robert Smithson sculpture, which was called Quick Millions. And I've been really interested in his work and his writings in particular, in terms of how he kind of views, the human interaction with the land and the manipulation of the land, and whether, he kind of really kind of plays around with this idea of how the land is treated, whether that treatment is inherently destructive or whether it's kind of cultivating the land in a way, or what, it's like a...
In the press release, which you were a big part of it was of putting together, you talked about his term destructive progress. Is that sort of a good way of thinking about what's going on here?
Yeah, I was trying to sort of illuminate this idea that that there's kind of this simultaneous creation and destruction when civilization sort of is developing, I guess. That in a way creation is inherently destructive, and destruction is also inherently creative in a way. That's true in a lot of natural
I think what's
processes.
Interesting is that when we do these talks and we use language to kind of talk about art, it almost kind of debunks what the art might be trying to do. So, why I say that is because, we're talking about these big terms like nature and culture, which are huge signifiers, and your work attempts to really kind of, I think, sit in the middle of that on some level.
Right.
And so, how, as we sort of experience this work, does that kind of get at what we're meant to experience, what you'd like us to experience?
Well, that's what I want the work to, I guess, reflect this process in a way that makes people kind of unsure about how they sit sort of on this spectrum of interacting with nature, maybe. I don't know.
Is this some sort of inherent critique of it, or is it something other than that? Like a critique of how these two things are very different, and how culture or human sort of productivity is also sort of coined with the destruction of land.
Well, yeah, part of the ideas that are going on for this is that I feel like there is this general perception that culture and nature are very distinct from each other, and that they are this kind of oppositional binary, and that there's kind of like this war going on, and half the people are saying that, kind of taking this activist role one way or the other, and I'm trying to explore the idea that there is no difference, that it's almost kind of like a semantic difference, that culture is just an extension of nature, that humans are a product of natural evolution, and that there is that there's no difference, really, that we're just an extension of nature, and hopefully by doing that maybe that people can sort of see things from kind of a neutral view as opposed to kind of a polarized view.
So would you say it's not activist then, this project. It's not trying to tell us or to maybe make us do something differently when we leave the room, as opposed to maybe think of a sort of more conceptual concept.
Yeah, and it's hard
to distinguish.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to put into words in terms of how it, relates to the work formally, which is something that I'm still working on. But what I want to sort of communicate is the idea that that there's always kind of more to it than what you think that there is. So in terms of, you mentioned activism, like taking an activist perspective, I feel like people kind of get pigeonholed, or they pigeonhole themselves into these positions where there's always something more complicated or more complex about the situation that they're not necessarily conscious of, that complicates or problematizes the agenda in a way. And so I would like, I guess, to sort of express the idea that there's more than one thing going on at any one given time, I guess, that you can't necessarily fall back on one sort of dogmatic approach to something.
And that being the binary again?
Right.
Because you mentioned Smithson, and there was something that I read this morning that I was thinking, this I like the way this sounds. I don't know necessarily how you would think about it, but this term that he uses called ruins in reverse, right? That he was talking about sort of the monuments in Passaic, New Jersey in 1967, and really trying to let us know that the derricks and all these buildings that were crumbling were actually monuments to him. And maybe I'm curious about that kind of thinking in connection to this idea of ruins in reverse, because these objects are not sort of precious in any way. They seem
right.
like they are in some ways deconstructing in front of our eyes.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the idea, is sort of seeing industrial activity or cultural activity as a process that is, I guess, to tie in what's missing, like it's ultimately sort of entropic, or that we are, all these things that we are creating are ultimately destined to sort of decay eventually, which kind of, to tie back to the title again, in terms of this idea of like millennia, in terms of how Smithson looks at things in this geological time frame where this is something that's, I mean, I guess I'm trying to look at things from a perspective of millennia, as opposed to like centuries or decades or days or minutes, or I feel like we tend to focus on things and kind of make these issues into kind of current states of emergency, whereas in the grand scheme of things, it's still just, regardless of what we create or what we destroy, the planet is going to continue to cycle in its own sort of natural cycle, I guess.
It's almost like quick millennia is like, right, a paradox. How can a millennia be quick?
Right.
And again, like maybe trying to create this ethos that kind of has both of them in it.
Yeah, well, again, it talks about, it just like depends on the perspective of who's talking. Like we tend to think about things in terms of years, or maybe maybe centuries, or maybe like based on human, maybe the last like 5 or 10,000 years maybe is what we consider to be the most important time in terms of the present. But if you talk to a geologist, he's going to talk about millions of years of formations of I mean, kind of like Spiral Jetty in a way touches on all these different like the formation of minerals and rocks. I mean, I don't know if that's kind of off of this or not, but
makes sense. I'm just thinking, just trying to distinguish between sort of what Smithson was doing and what you're doing, and by doing that, I think better get a handle on the bigger idea of sitting in between nature and culture in some sense. Because it seems like with Spiral Jetty, as you say, I mean that he passed away very shortly after making that, so he didn't get to see it. So it'd be interesting to hear what he had to say about it. But it's become quite a fetishized object in the end.
Right.
It's definitely reflects his interest in entropy, but I feel like it kind of veers more on sort of oddly on the sort of object-based level. I mean,
right.
where does that work with, again, the works here, these huge panels?
Well, it brings up an interesting part of the process of this project, which was that there was a whole learning curve that I went through in terms of getting the paper to not just kind of fall apart from the paint and the pressure, and because it's a delicate paper, and the first few days of the process, it was hard to figure out just logistically how to get something that was actually able to hang up to be an object in a way. So in a sense, that was almost. So in a way, that was almost more important. I mean, I was going through this process, and it was just a process. It was like there wasn't a product at the end of it. And on the one hand, I was conflicted, whether that was good for there not to be anything, for the project just to be this.
Does that be good or bad? But
yeah.
I guess maybe an unexpected way of exploring it
right.
outside of the process.
Well, I wanted to have, this kind of multitude of prints at the end, which then I would be able to rearrange and sort of create kind of this installation that would then sort of represent a space that people could sort of walk throughout or interact with in a way that would change sort of the landscape of what was there before. So getting back to a metaphor, the heavy equipment comes in and flattens the earth, and then the structure gets erected, and then the people go in and they have all this stuff to do or whatever, to live or work or experience, whether it's something.
And here you have
for any
what
purpose.
Could be a ruin in reverse then, where it is some sort of object, but it's not your. I mean, all I could think about actually going in there. I mean, I had this idea of what it would look like before, which was going to be like this huge piece of paper that maybe formally looked a lot like what was happening during the abstract expressionist period, but that would be sort of on the wall, something for us to look at, not interact with. And then going in, it's completely different because you can't look at it in the way that those paintings from the 50s and 60s are meant to be kind of experienced. They break that potential for you to fetishize it or make it something special.
Yeah, well, I did want it to be something like an intimate experience, to see them, to be able to be kind of immersed within the work in that way. Or I guess, contrary to that sort of abstract expressionist way, that they were done. You mentioned that, and it's interesting because that's another sort of paradox for me, because there are some formal qualities to the within the work that I can align with sort of abstract expressionism, I guess, in a way that just on a kind of on a strictly formal level of the paint quality and the texture and this sort of thing. But that was one thing that I really actually didn't expect, which I feel like was kind of a problem with the process, was that when I figured out the process of how I would have to apply the paint, it immediately became sort of channeling Jackson Pollock in a way that
I was going to say that
looking
at the video, it looked like a modern day Jackson Pollock dripping and video of his work right behind us, right?
Yeah, and
accidental or something?
that I have to say that was an accident. I mean, I was kind of hoping to be able to use some other tools to sort of manipulate the paint, or like to use rollers. So it would almost be more like using like a printmaking brayer to apply the ink, like because that was more. Because it had kind of, because like I said, this project sort of came out of making these prints in the studio, but because it just didn't work physically, I ended up having to do it this way. And I think that there's, you could sort of make an interesting connection with that in terms of the interpreting Pollock as a performative. Art making,
action painting,
which is action painting, which I don't know if that's necessarily the way that's generally or has or was sort of
no, it
described
definitely
by the
wasn't.
books.
I mean, the way Greenberg and most dominant art history talks about his works are, yes, he was sort of in the works, but that end product really is what's important, those forms and those colors and what he's dripping with. But actually, Amelia Jones has written an interesting chapter called The Pollockian Performative, and she does kind of, queer that to bring attention to that part of the process, to re-embody it in a sense. But again, I'm not sure if that level of embodiment, your embodiment, is of concern. I mean, I think the videos might, lead one to believe it is, because it's you there. But is it just? Could it be just a body of some kind, not necessarily you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it was critical that it be me personally doing it. I think it was important that it be visible that it's a human interacting with the materials and sort of working in conjunction with the machinery, because that sort of addresses this other sort of binary of like man versus machine, or man, that machine is a product of man, or and sort of touching back on that nature culture thing or nature industry thing. But it was important that it be it was the process, and the person doing it was important. Like if I had just done what you see now, and the whole the actual using the process of making the prints had just been a means to it wasn't just a means to an end. It would have been a whole different. I feel like
it's just even seeing you in the video, on the sort of the steamroller going in. I mean, there's this, kind of it's a bit of a spectacle, if you will, and it kind of, again, it can shift attention to a different a part of the project, which again, it seems like you're not necessarily as so interested in.
It definitely was, I guess, a spectacle, and I don't really know exactly how I feel about that. I mean, it was, I think it's. There's a level of spectacle as kind of entertainment. I think that's interesting. I know that it's a way to engage people. I guess that's productive in a way. I don't know that that's it's potentially could sort of distract from the idea behind it. I don't know. But
I just have a question on that note, because something interesting about printmaking, there's many different ways to make prints, right? Usually large prints, you need a large printing press. So at the end of the day, you don't need a steamroller to make monoprints, right? So there is this deliberate choice making, which we've been over, which is sort of this overwrought using force, this overforce kind of thing. And so I just wonder, maybe, and again, it's about this sort of culture, this desire to build up and tear down forests and build up cities and all that. But it's also absurd. Is what we're kind of missing. It's like that no one needs a steamroller to make a monoprint, but there's this absurd quality which is being employed, which maybe we maybe understand it differently now that it's happened or something. But
what's interesting about, how does humor, it's true, fit into this, if at all? Because that does sound like, right, it is absurd, right? It's true, you don't need a steamroller to do that.
That whole thing is absurd. I mean, yeah, totally.
But it's part, like what I'm trying to say is I understand, like that makes it much more interesting to me that, you're using this absurdity, like there's this overuse of a force that you don't need to use, but you're making that's sort of the point that you're making.
Right.
Like this overzealous force.
Well, part of it came from, just kind of logistical, trying to figure out how I could make bigger and bigger prints. That was part of it. But then, I was immediately kind of faced with the reality that I needed to. That if I was going to do that, it had to be. There had to be ideas tied to it, and so there,
But it would be a fundamentally different piece if, say, you wanted to make the print in this gallery, and you wanted to make a print. You had a piece of paper that was as big as the floor, and then you literally could ride tracks. That would be an entirely different. That's you can make it monoprint as big as a football field.
Yeah. Well, now, every time, when I'm driving down the highway and I see, they're doing all this road construction out west, and there's, I see these ones that are like huge, and I'm like, I would love to drive that over and make something with that,
What's the urge behind that?
It's a little psychoanalysis here.
Yeah, well, part of it.
Which is interesting with your prior work in construction.
Yeah, part of it, and also I grew up sort of driving tractors. A lot of it is this personal, like I like using tools and machines. But I'm sure that you could psychoanalyze it and through a lot of probably scary
My
ways.
husband drive a bulldozer once.
Yeah.
I never saw a happier person in my life.
I don't know if it's I don't know if it's like a.
Shady grin. So I think
Yeah.
it has. I'm so glad you brought that up because when I watched it, it was absurdism.
Then that night, it was absurd.
Yeah.
But it reminded me of when we someone borrowed a bulldozer, and it's fun.
Yeah.
But it loops, what I'm trying to say also is that it loops into this idea of this culture-nature binary where we are talking about this polarized debate about our planet's health because we're destroying its natural resources. So, in a way, it is about this, the drive to do that. We want to do this stuff. It's delightful to human beings to plow stuff over.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is part of that in it because, and there's actually a book that I read called The Art of Cruelty, which is a really interesting book, and it kind of explores this idea that we have this sort of innate human proclivity for violence and destruction, and whether it's a product of just sort of natural evolution or if it's a cultural construction or what it is, it's kind of there, and there are all these different examples of it, and so that's kind of the binary. Yeah, we want to cultivate and nurture, but at the same time, there's something about breaking stuff that's fun, and
I think right, that's an important point in this stuff because it's it's what makes it, I think. There's of course activist artwork, but I bring that up again because I think the artwork is not trying to make judgments necessarily about how we should behave, but it's not ignoring what's happening either. It's sort of kind of keeping it on the side in a sense.
Yeah, I feel like there's a part of me that's environmentalist, we should stop all this, what we're doing to the earth, but then, fundamentally or philosophically, there's a part of me that just thinks that this is the natural progression of human evolution, and not that that's a free card to just go destroy everything, but that what we are doing is just the kind of nature, the cycle of nature, even if it seems destructive to nature. And getting back to the nature-culture binary, that's what I'm trying to say, is that there is no distinction between culture and nature. Culture is just, when you take this oppositional position, then, I don't know, at least to like counter productivity or something. I don't know.
I think if you take the oppositional, kind of approach, then one becomes good and the other becomes bad. Like, or
Right.
you get into these further binaries, it seems,
Right.
which are kind of murky and not that productive, really, I guess. And so it seems like you're kind of working against that kind of thing, or aren't they doing it great?
Like with the display of them, I mean, it's almost like a joke about Chinese scrolls. And they're all about whatever that discussion is, what's from natural art, their paintings and things.
Right.
So there's almost a joke there. I mean, I think I really admire how that's set up in there and how you experience the actions and happening. I think there's something that's Eastern elegance in that respect. But that, and then the overall effect is pretty close to maybe what philosophically a Chinese painter would want to do. There's a whole lot of archaeology there for me too. Like the machine is a glacier or something like that. But really do admire the way you set it up. It all came out of necessity, I know.
Right.
Because once you can't really figure these things out until you're in the middle of the puddle.
Right.
And they ask the question and you try to solve it. It's clearly really exciting to see that happen.
Well, that was another sort of getting back to my professional background. Like that was one, I've kind of always had this tendency to, or almost as, a professional woodworker, like, craftsman, there's this attention to having to plan everything out and the plan installation, and it all has to be planned and well crafted. And so I was trying to play around with that juxtaposition by having this ceiling grid that was, the way that I was going to make them and have the sticks to staple to, so I would have this whole planned out, crafted process, but then at the same time, the production of the prints and the composition would just be kind of like, I have no idea, what's going to happen. I can't. So I was trying to embrace both the sides of me, to just kind of be, spontaneous and also be true to this sort of, craftsman thing.
Craftsman background. There's like another context in which I wanted to have you discuss your work really, which is the element of spirituality or religion. And I bring that up because they're the first American movement, the Hudson School, was very much about artists, sort of interested in a very particular kind of nature. And be interesting to kind of hear you just talk that through and where the differences are.
Yeah, well, I did. At one point, I was very interested in the whole transcendentalism movement and the Hudson River School, because they, the ideas of like this reverence for nature, resonated with how I felt about, how we should interact with nature, or, at this point I'm talking still kind of as nature being a separate thing, but, they, obviously they kind of attributed this nature and reverence to kind of to a Christian God, which I, pretty much distanced myself from. I mean, my own spiritual, I do have, a lot of interest in Taoist philosophy, which can be applied to a lot of what I'm talking about. Like in terms of like trying to disintegrate this distinction, because the Tao is all encompassing and that there is no separate anything.
Right.
It's all part of the Tao, which includes destruction, however you want to look at it.
And I don't know myself enough about Taoism, but I think that's actually a really good way to kind of begin to better understand again what kinds of things you're talking about, because the limitations of language that we're running against here
Right.
a little bit, or I feel there can be these limitations in a sense.
Or maybe my just inability to express it, right? I don't know.
No, I wouldn't say that.
Yeah, well, yeah, because Taoism is really hard to talk about because if you talk about it, then you're missing the point.
Okay, so we won't talk.
I mean, you can.
Right,
That's the thing. I mean, that's what the philosophy says, that if you can describe it, then you don't understand it.
There's an element of absurdity with the two of us actually up here talking about all of this kind of stuff too, on some level.
Yeah.
When you mention it, I mean, just because there's this idea of going in and experiencing the work on an affective level, which is such a different thing than what we're attempting to do here, or we're
Right.
trying to connect it as much as possible, but it will always fall slightly short of that too.
I mean, I guess I like the way that I like having this, space for people. This space for people to be able to immerse themselves in, and also to be able to kind of be aware of the process that was made, that that was employed to get there, and then maybe from that, maybe have people then kind of reevaluate what they see when they see, and maybe this human interaction with the land. I don't know, like that we're kind of on a seesaw, like there's destructive and creative. There's like absurd and horrific and beautiful elements to I guess human activity, all at the same time within each other, coexisting.
There's, I think, something very important. I'm not exactly even sure I can articulate why. It would take me some more time, I think, to think about this, but that you include the visitor. I mean, we're participating in this process. We're no longer sort of outside of it, and that's something new. Again, I didn't expect that, and so there's I think something very interesting there where you're pulling that into the conversation and the process that happened before and the work there.
Right.
I mean, there's one other thing actually. But, you mentioned the book, The Art of Cruelty. That the author's name I'm forgetting.
Maggie Nelson.
Okay, Maggie Nelson. It's in like 2011, and you said something to me which I was like, oh, this is helpful as well, to kind of get a better sense of what you're talking about. She talks about this idea of, in this kind of examination of works like Kerouac's, or these sort of grotesque sort of images, if you will, or things that we can't visualize, we just feel affectively. But she talks about this notion of neutrality, right, as a different way of approaching this whole kind of topic. And could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I found it like...
Yeah. Well, so the book is basically, she's kind of approaching or exploring, this idea of how we're so violent, and we have this penchant for, grotesque and violent, destructive art. She talks a lot about like Paul McCarthy and Anna Mendieta and Marquis de Sade as his writings, and how we all. She goes through Chris Burden. She goes through all these things, and the whole time she's kind of like, these are these really kind of polarizing artworks. Like people tend to see them, and then they're. You either kind of like condemn them or you embrace them. There tends to almost not be a middle ground, but she kind of tries to forge this middle ground where you don't necessarily judge it, but you just allow it to be part of who we are, that we do these things, or that we like looking at these things, or that we don't like looking at them, and that all that's okay. But at the end, she kind of proposes this idea of like taking a neutral position where you kind of allow like love and hate and violence and love to sort of not sort of be on opposite sides of a spectrum, but coexistent in a way that then can, I guess, somehow be enlightening in a different way.
Well, I guess I'm just, maybe to clarify why I brought it up, I just think it's incredibly odd to talk about Kara Walker's works as neutral or creating a neutral sort of affect. But there's something actually really interesting about that idea, because I feel like maybe what she's getting at is this idea that the work demands that you see several things at the same time, and that you can't kind of let go of one, which otherwise can happen. And that's a very interesting, again, way of circling back to your work in the Taoist kind of aspect of what you're doing. Really, again, like helped crystallize what might be going on in your work.
Yeah, I mean, basically that I guess that there really is no definitive right or wrong, there just kind of is a lot of gray area, and if you can, I don't know, it's hard to really tie.
And just think of one thing too, because what can happen with these discussions of Taoism and even interconnectedness is it becomes apolitical. And I absolutely do not think that your work is apolitical in that way. Like it brings it up, even though it might not do it, I think, overtly. Like it is there, the politics, what's going on. But again, they seem like they're kind of left at the sides there for you to experience and think about, and not necessarily be making kind of these really quick or easy decisions by any of them. But it is highly politicized, even if it is interconnected. Like it's not
right. Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing. Like, there is this aspect of, I guess trying to illuminate how, the effects of destruction that we create. I guess it's in terms of. Well, I guess there's this political component of addressing how we sort of treat the environment. Is that what you mean?
It's not a heavy-handed thing, I guess.
I think that we do a lot of destructive things in the environment, but most of those things, I believe, like by and large, those things are like designed to, benefit humanity in a way that's productive. It's kind of a slippery slope, because there are a lot of things that I don't.
Well, again, I think it's like you're saying both at the same time, right?
Yeah.
You're not trying to say maybe that it's completely productive or not, but that it could be, and it could not be as well. I was just thinking this one, I forgot to say this earlier, and people have been contributing, which is great. But do you guys have any questions for Nick?
Right, looking at when you're dealing with liquid-like paint on the surface, primer, dealing with gravity, surface tension, and sort of friction with kinds of things. I think Pollock put a same on the ground to eliminate gravity, because if you've done them on a wall, gravity would have influenced the painting. I think what you've been doing, when I first saw it, I was very impressed. You were trying to take control of gravity, use gravity yourself. By putting it on the ground, you now, the gravity from being orthogonal to us, you can control gravity by driving this thing over. So you're going to inject gravity into what you're doing under your control rather than let nature and gravity's influence on what you Wayne and myself and others drive these big machines, it's gravity isn't big enough. We want to be, gravity is bothering us all the time. But we get on these big machines to take control of nature to drive gravity, make it smash it more and make gravity lateral as well as vertical. And so I saw this as me, you were trying to take control of gravity that would influence this. If you try to do it on a wall, gravity would want to do this kind of stuff. Pull it down.
Right.
You said, I'm going to inject gravity when I'm ready, when I want it, as opposed to letting it be here naturally.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about that in terms of gravitational force, but it's definitely there. I mean, and in terms of sort of harnessing that natural, physical, law of nature. That definitely ties in with it all because in a way, it's almost, in that sense, it's somewhat problematic because I am then, taking control over nature, I guess, in a way, but that's...
Okay, but it's such a hyper-performed bit of control that it becomes absurd. It doesn't necessarily take on other kinds of connotations that could be. It seems to Pollock's work is it ended up on the walls, right, even though they're done on the
We're
floor.
thinking medium, which is probably getting, going to get replaced by digital media, unfortunately. When you go into it, you actually do it, you get to use a little control, and you start to figure out how to solve problems more. It happens in a lot of different medias with, like FIU, we can shut down on that for you just opened up. We have a professor teaching it now. But when it was gone, I just didn't understand it, empty. And going back, even as a painter, sometimes you use the print technique to figure out problems or even, start to answer things. And you can do them really fast. And like you have to figure out releases and all that. That's why you did all do that what you got here, I'm sure. But it helps that kind of, it's one of the processes that really makes you get into trouble and try to get out of it.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad to see somebody like playing with it. You took it out of the shop. And you can.
I got into some trouble too. I had to, when I was doing the prints in the studio, I always wanted to keep part of the ghost image of the previous print on the subsequent print, so it became this whole sequential thing, and I wanted to recreate that here, but because of the limitations of the materials I was using, as the paint and materials would sort of accumulate on the floor, they would get less cooperative, and it reached the point where the paper just kind of just tore up into nothing. That sort of, that, I don't know if we mentioned it already, that kind of lack of control, that kind of giving up of, control, I think it's really enjoyable. Yeah. I like that a lot.
It seems the prints that you made, and I think when you foregrounded that initially, it had like a huge influence on where you've sort of gone.
Yeah, well, this this project, I can't thank Locust Projects enough for this because it's really, I feel like it's kind of the culmination of almost my whole first year, like a lot of the work that I did. And, even with the kind of the absurd element of it, like turning the printing press into a steamroller, through that I was able to, I think, kind of solidify some of the ideas that I was looking for when I was making them in the studio. And so I had, that I had a lot of momentum, I think, from this past year, and so that's why I'm so glad I was able to do it here, because if I would have had to kind of shelve the idea, I don't think it would have
Also, I mean, what's nice about what Locust Project is doing is that, when you're a student at an MFA program, supposedly you're in process, right? It's almost like you're cloistered away and your work is not supposed to be seen. There are still those very sort of old school ideas that had tapped onto being a student or an MFA student. But here, I think it's wonderful that there's a space for an MFA student to come in and do something that they have to finish and be responsible for what it is, and it is always in process, but it's wonderful to be in that space.
Great. Well, just wanted to go right ahead.
Yeah, very, very quickly. It's interesting, as someone who's professionally in the science and the arts, the dichotomy between, natural and nature and culture is something you don't hear talked about in the sciences themselves, in the sciences and social sciences. There is no natural world, there's no human world, it's just the world. And when we mention Taoism, I also think that it's a cultural thing because, I'm Native American, and in our culture, there isn't that false dichotomy either. And I think that that's true of a lot of these cultures and indigenous cultures as well. So I'm glad to see you kind of doing something that sort of weakens that false dichotomy, which a lot of professions, people in the sciences, people are indigenous, would not have in the first place.
Right. Well, a lot of that ties in with some of the research I've been doing is by E.O. Wilson. I don't know if you're familiar with E.O. Wilson. And he's a lot of his stuff is really interesting to me, and that's what sort of his ideas with sociobiology and the sort of thing where he's basically trying to unify the social sciences and the natural sciences and humanities and everything, because it's all according to sociobiology just a product of natural science in general. So yeah, but I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Anybody else?
I also just wanted to take a second and thank Andrew Horton.
He's
standing in the back, but hi, Andrew.
Yeah.
So Andrew's also an MFA candidate at FAU, and he was incredibly helpful. This project also produced these videos, so I just wanted to give many thanks to Andrew.
Yeah, definitely. I meant to mention that because he actually sort of, it wasn't necessarily planned out, but he helped a lot with the project, and his assistance almost kind of became vital in a way. There was sort of when we were producing the prints, I had it all figured out to where I could do it by myself, but when it came time to actually make them, and then the materials kind of demanded this rapid, process, which it was really hard to do by myself. And when Andrew kind of just jumped in and started helping me with it, and so we were able to kind of establish this flow, this rhythm, which then actually created this other aspect to the project that I didn't anticipate, which is where anytime that you're doing any kind of project or work, I mean, I associate it mostly with like construction work, but when you kind of get into a flow with the person you're working with, and the work almost kind of becomes intuitive in a way, more intuitive, or it's really interesting how there reached a point where we had all the motions down, and we were just sort of started to talk about other stuff.
Right. Like, you have to say, okay, we got it.
Yeah, and that was a really. Then it was like this doubling up. Like we had this machine, and then our working together became like a well-oiled machine. It was fun, but it was that was nice to have that. I liked it.
Great. Okay, well,